Morning, everybody. Thank you, Panagiotis, for inviting me to give this keynote. As you can see, I'm going to be talking about trust in this emerging AI world that we find ourselves in. My premise really with this talk is that generative AI, and we're all familiar with at least some of what it can do and what its potential is. My premise is that it's sowing the seeds of doubt amongst consumers, whether they can trust what they see in the marketing messages, amongst voters and the electorate, whether they can believe what they're seeing, particularly across social platforms. And I think it's those social platforms that provide fertile ground for these seeds to both grow and spread. However, at the core of what I want to talk about is that maybe history offers us some hope, some lessons that we can learn that perhaps can give us some ideas for how we might tackle some of the problems that we're facing. And at the end, I'm going to present some thoughts around how I think, based on what I'm going to be talking about, perhaps we might address some of these problems in a practical way. So I've broken the talk down into three key elements. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about the AI problem as I see it, in terms of how it's undermining trust across different areas. Then I want to talk about historical precedents, particularly one area of focus, and how that might give us some lessons for how we might tackle some of the problems. And then finally, I want to translate that into what does that look like in the 21st century for practical measures that we can perhaps encourage, adopt, or encourage our policymakers to adopt. So we've all heard of deepfakes and the manipulation of images, text, videos increasingly now. And these have often been put to misuse in political campaigning. As Professor Humphreys said just now, we've got elections here this year in the United States, India, and we're seeing an increasing amount of fake content, deep fakes being spread across established media where they aren't able to spot it, but increasingly across social platforms. But it's not just political chicanery that's involved here. We're seeing increasing amounts of financial fraud and increasingly sophisticated criminals that are using some of these technologies to the extent that they can simulate known people's voices, create video, and actually fool people in real time in video conferences. There was a case a couple of months ago revealed WPP, one of the world's largest marketing groups based in the UK, their CEO was the target of one of these scams on a Zoom or a Teams call, I'm not sure which, where people were fooled into believing they were actually interacting with the CEO. Even more recently, Arup, global engineering group, lost $25 million in a similar fraud deepfake video conference scam. So I think the point I'm trying to make is that these scams are becoming more sophisticated and increasingly difficult to spot. But it's not just fraudulent behavior that's taking place here. We're seeing media enterprises themselves reported recently that News Corporation, the global media group, has been using AI to produce up to 3,000 local news stories a week across their local news titles in Australia. So it's being put to commercial use as well at scale. And it's not just restricted to the big businesses that can afford it. The cost of using these tools is coming down to the extent, there was an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal recently about one of their journalists who, for about $100 or so, managed to get a developer to create a website and use generative AI to create thousands of stories being generated every week, and fake political stories as well. I'm not a great believer in technology forecasts. Forecasting technology and where it's going to go and who's going to use it is very often a fool's errand. But there was a recent forecast by IDC, one of the more respected technology analyst firms, that predicted that by next year, 90% of online content could be generated by AI. Maybe an exaggeration, but we're certainly heading in that direction. At the individual level, it's no news to anybody here that, there's around 4 to 5 billion smartphone users globally. Increasingly, these apps that are able to generate fake images and video now are freely available across the iOS Apple App Store and the Android Google Play Store. And there's a whole raft of them I've just highlighted for here. And very often, these are put to used for entertainment purposes by individuals. But there's also a darker side to a lot of these apps as well, and how they're used in creating deep fake images without the consent of the people involved. There's actually one of the most well-established and long-running soap operas in this country, Coronation Street, if anybody here has ever watched it or watches it, has currently got a storyline running about deep fake porn. And I think it illustrates, the reason I bring it up here is that it illustrates the extent to which this is entering into the mainstream. When a soap opera starts talking about these problems, it's not a niche, esoteric issue. So we've got the individuals making these things on smartphones. Again, no news to anybody here. It's the amplification of this content across social platforms and the billions of users that are able to do that I think is really at the core of a lot of this problem. And it's not just, us here perhaps, or certainly me and other researchers that are concerned about this, and policymakers. Police forces themselves are becoming increasingly concerned. There was a recent report from Europol, the organization that coordinates policing activities across Europe and European police forces. And in the report, they outline different areas where they see concerns around generative AI and how it's being used and how it might be used in the future. One of the things that stood out to me, is one I've highlighted here, is that one of their concerns, which to me is particularly frightening, is that evidence itself that's used in courts of law may be artificially generated itself, to the extent that it could undermine our trust in the legal system and what we're seeing presented as evidence. And I think when you start thinking about going down those roads, it becomes particularly scary. So I presented a dark picture of misdeeds and all sorts of concerns. Hopefully haven't scared people too much. What I want to do now is move on to what I see as potentially an area offering us hope, historical lesson. And that's around poisoning, food poisoning in the 19th and early 20th century. What can we learn from that in terms of how we might deal with generative AI today? So the context really for this is the industrialization across many economies that took place in the 19th century. And we saw a massive shift in populations from rural areas into more urban environments. The data I've got here is for England and Wales, and it charts the shift that took place in populations, in the population of England and Wales, from rural to urban areas. At the beginning of the century, beginning of the 19th century, about 35% of the population lived in urban environments, with the rest, 65%, the other 2/3, living in agricultural, rural areas. That shifted over the course of that century to the extent that by the end of it, nearly 80% of the populations of England and Wales were living in urban areas, and about 20, just over 20, had remained in agricultural areas. The implication for this particular talk of that shift is that it distanced the population from food production for the first time. People up till then had largely known where their food had come from. It had come from very local areas, often produced by themselves. The move into cities meant they were distanced from that for the first time. And it created a lot of pressure to create cheaper, mass-produced foodstuffs to feed this rapidly growing urban populations. And that opened up incentives and opportunities for people to adulterate food with additives that perhaps were harmful, and at the other extreme, one extreme, actually poisoning food, putting additives in that were actually killing people. There were no food standards at the time to deal with that, to legislate against that and impose penalties on people at the time. And it became a growing concern. There are numerous cases of food poisoning and food adulteration. I've pulled up 3 here, sort of illustrative of what was going on. So, for example, in the 1850s in New York, we had the so-called swill milk scandal, where cows, dairy cows that had been fed on all sorts of unsanitary food products, were producing milk that was poisonous to those that drinked it. And over 8,000 infants died as a result of that at the time. In England, there was the widespread practice of adding alum to bread in a way, in an attempt to make it last longer. It reduced the amount of water in the bread, made it last longer, cheaper to produce and store. That had a particularly negative effect on the children that ate that bread and led to many cases of rickets in children. And then perhaps a bit more extreme, there were many cases of poisoning of sweets taking place. Sweets at that time were largely made locally in pharmacists, by chemists, and sold locally. There was a case, and it was an accidental case of poisoning, where a pharmacist had been selling sweets that had been laced with arsenic, accidentally put into the sweets, killed 20 or so people and injured many more, most of them children at the time. It was the accumulation of all these stories and the undermining of trust in the food production system that led to growing concerns amongst the population. In the United States, there was one case in particular that's often referred to as the embalmed beef scandal of the 1890s. And this really came to light in the 1898 Spanish-American War that was being fought across Cuba, Puerto Rico, and a few other territories. It was reported at the time that more US soldiers died from food poisoning, the food that they were being fed while they were in the army. More soldiers died from food poisoning than actually died in combat in that war. A reporter at the time that went out to see what was going on reported back, and I've put it here, that the extract from their reporting, because I think it sums up the sort of the horror of the situation. The reporter said of this food that they were being fed, it was so duly embalmed with all flavour of life, and every suck of nourishment gone from it, though having nevertheless a putridity of odour more pungent than ever reaches the nostrils from a properly embalmed cadaver. So strong language, obviously a bit journalistic, I guess, but it really coalesced public opinion in the United States at the time that something needed to be done, that bad enough that we're eating this food as citizens, feeding it and killing our troops while they're fighting on behalf of the country is, totally unacceptable. So in 1906, in the United States, the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed. And this had 2 key purposes. And there's sort of overlaps here with some of the legislation that's coming out at the moment around big technology and artificial intelligence. One of the purposes of the Act was to break up a sort of quasi-monopoly or oligopoly of meat production. Most meat was being packed, cows were being slaughtered in the Chicago area in meat packing plants, and that was controlled by 6 large companies. And there was concern that from a financial point of view, this wasn't healthy, but also that they had little incentive because they had control of the whole process amongst themselves, little incentive to introduce sanitary working conditions and in the slaughter yards. So it was partly to break up the beef trust, as it was called, but also to enforce and bring in standards of hygiene in the way that cattle were killed and how the meat was then dealt with afterwards. That act was amended 6 years later in the Shirley Amendment, prompted by another high-profile poisoning case, this time with Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup for teething and colicky babies. sounds like a very benign product. The adverts showed Mrs. Winslow herself with her children cuddled up beside her, presumably having just given them some of the soothing syrup. Unfortunately, it had been laced with morphine, and quite a large number of infants died as a result. And the purpose of that amendment was to make it illegal to claim medical benefits from a product that couldn't be proven. So I've talked about some of the food poisoning cases and the concerns and legislation that arose from that. At the same time that this was going on, we saw the rise of brands, particularly in the food industry. This was an attempt by food producers to build trust amongst consumers, that if you see our label, you can trust what's in it. And it was also a way of differentiating themselves from their competitors. Legislation that ran alongside that at the time in the UK, in the US, and across much of Europe around trademarks started to come in. And that was to protect, partly anyway, to protect the reputations or the brands themselves and the ways that companies could use them and prevent imitators from pretending that they were a brand that they weren't. So we saw the companies themselves coming in with their branding and then legislation to support that. The third area that I think history teaches us related to food hygiene and poisoning is a little more recent, sort of going back 70, 80 years or so, where there were widespread campaigns to improve hygiene standards in the home, in areas where food was being prepared. So we had educational programs in schools, colleges, to encourage children as they learn how to cook to adopt safe practices, as well as homemakers and anybody involved in preparing food in commercial environments. And that had a big impact in reducing inadvertent food poisoning. Before I go on to the third sort of section of my talk, I just want to mention one thing that I think is an interesting story, but also again had practical implications. A particularly novel approach to understanding or better understanding the impact of these different additives that were being put into food and whether they were dangerous, and if so, how dangerous they were, was an initiative set up by Dr. Harvey Washington Wiley in 1902. And this was a group of young male volunteers that he gathered together to all live together and all eat food prepared in the same kitchen. And it very quickly was adopted the nickname of the Poison Squad. The objective was to understand what impact these additives might have. So these young, healthy men, volunteers, hasten to add, were fed increasing amounts of poison in their food with their knowledge, and different types of additives. So things like borax, sulfuric acid, saltpeter, formaldehyde, copper sulfate, amongst others, were fed in increasing amounts, increasing doses in their food to see what happened and whether they became ill. Obviously, if they started becoming ill, they'd stop feeding them that. For the first time, there was scientific evidence as to what the impact of these additives might be, rather than more anecdotal evidence. And it was another factor in leading to the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act, because of the evidence that they managed to gather together. So I'll bring this together a bit at the end, but what I want to talk about now is what might some solutions look like. And these are things that are happening already and things that hopefully will happen in the future in terms of dealing with the generative AI problem. I've broken it down into three areas, and it sort of maps quite nicely onto the historical cases I've talked about. So broken it down into legal areas where we might think about developing new laws, or certainly enforcing the ones we've got, technical and commercial issues or aspects of dealing with this problem, and finally more social, particularly educational initiatives and what role that should play. So AI trust solutions. Professor Humphreys, in her introduction, already mentioned the UK Online Safety Act. And one of the provisions of that, this came into force last year, one of its provisions was to make it a criminal offence for people to share intimate deep fakes without the consent of people involved in the images, which we'll have to wait and see the extent to which that has an impact, if it has an impact. But it shows that, legislation is being quite specific around some of the things that should and shouldn't happen. More ambitiously, the EU AI Act, which I believe comes into force across member states in the next month or so, it's a particularly ambitious attempt. It covers all sorts of different aspects of both AI development and deployment. And one of the key sort of tenets of it is that there is a responsibility for those that are developing AI products and those that are using it to be transparent in the ways that it's being used. And I think that's going to be a key thing to focus on moving forward. The United States is perhaps less hands-on in its legislative approach so far anyway. There was an AI executive order passed last year. It's more focused around guidelines and standards rather than the more prescriptive and strict elements in the EU Act, but it's a start. There's also worth pointing out quite a large number, running into the hundreds, of state and local legislation being discussed, debated, and in some cases passed. That I think there's a bit of a concern amongst those that watch this area that maybe that's going to add to confusion where you've got conflicting state regulations, but we'll see how that plays out. The second area where I think there's a key role is in the commercial sector, amongst the companies, particularly companies that are both developing these technologies, but also there's a growing number of startups that are offering technical solutions to dealing with the AI problem, as I presented it here anyway. One of them is a very new company called IsAI, and it's an attempt, and it's early days yet, so we'll see whether it's successful, to provide transparency where organizations are using generative AI content. It's a way to transparently state that, but also at the back end that this company is developing to have an authentication system so that people that are looking at that content or consuming it can trust where it's come from. And the focus very much with this company is offering public sector and private companies a way to comply, particularly with the EU legislation, but also with what's going on in the United States and where things might be heading there. So just as legislation in the 20th century forced companies in many countries to label the ingredients that they put into their products, creating some degree of transparency anyway, we're seeing some of the social platforms move in that direction. And again, this is largely a response to the new legislation that's coming out. TikTok announced recently that it's going to automatically label AI-generated user content. How that would work, I don't know. How they would always know whether something had been AI-generated. But anyway, they've announced that's their plan. And Instagram are experimenting with a similar approach as a way to inform its users whether what they're looking at is generative AI content. So we're seeing some of these companies starting to move in that direction. As I say, I think largely prompted by the legislation, but that's a good thing. And then finally, and I think this is in many ways the most important aspect of what I see as one of the solutions, education. AI literacy programs are starting to be developed and rolled out in some schools. And I think we've seen IT literacy programs over the last 30 or so years. I think AI literacy is much more important. IT literacy was more about helping people get the most from the IT tools that they're using. AI literacy, certainly in the way I see it, is much more about educating people about what AI is, but crucially what it can do and how might you spot whether something has had AI inputs in its creation. So I think that's crucial. There's various pieces of research going on around this. There was a paper I looked at recently by Ng et al., came out a couple of years ago, and they've taken Bloom's taxonomy of learning and adapted it, not significantly, but adapted it for an AI educational program. So if anyone's interested in that, it's worth following up. All my sources and references are at the end of the presentation. So I guess my key point is that establishing and maintaining trust is key here. And we've seen brands that many of us would recognize do that over the last 100, 150 years or so, and very successfully kept going to the extent that we still recognize some of those products. They haven't really changed that much. I suspect that a lot of these companies are going to have bigger challenges or big challenges going forward around concerns about ultra processed food, but that's another matter. What I think is key here in what we're looking at is the news and information brands and how they are going to deal with this rapidly changing world. So, not everybody trusts every news outlet, obviously, and it's become perhaps more fractured over the last few years. But broadly, there are mainstream media brands, BBC, PBS in the States, New York Times, Guardian, FT, whatever, that certainly amongst large chunks of the population are broadly trusted. They have editorial control over the content they produce. They, will have their own biases, obviously, but broadly, they are trusted by large sections of the population anyway. And I think that's going to be key going forward, the input that these companies have in the generative AI content that's produced. Something I saw a couple of weeks ago, OpenAI, the company behind ChatGPT, recently launched its preferred publisher program. This is an attempt to get on board some of these big media and information brands. One of the problems that a lot of these large language model developers have got is that they don't have enough content or information or data to train these models on. There's been a lot of suspicious practices around scraping that content in the development of some of the models that we use at the moment. But going forward, and certainly at the moment, they're trying to do it in a more legitimate way, partly as a way of having a competitive advantage over their competitors if they've got exclusive deals with certain news and information brands. But their preferred publisher program is an attempt to do that, to bring on board some of these brands, some of these companies, in return for financial payment. So it may be a good thing for some of these companies themselves. What I thought was interesting is that in their pitch deck that they created to present to these news brands, they say it's only available to select high quality editorial partners. So you've got OpenAI, the company that kick-started a lot of this generative AI excitement with its ChatGPT product, actually acknowledging that it needs some of these companies at least, and the trusted ones with high quality editorial content to help them move forward. So I think that's a key thing. So my concluding thoughts as I wrap up here is that I think my prediction, and probably wrong, but I'll predict it anyway, is that some of these companies behind some of these media brands are going to realize a massive premium in the value that's placed on them, that they are sitting on archives of, billions of gigabytes or whatever of content that they've amassed over the years. And they've got the editorial teams in place now to continue producing that news, information, analysis, whatever it is, that I think they're going to be valued at an increasing premium, particularly as we see so much low quality Me Too generative AI content being put out across the web and across social platforms. I think technological solutions are going to be really important, and I've given you an example of one or two that may have some part to play in that. But there's a danger here that the technology companies themselves, and we've seen OpenAI getting involved in a lot of the policy discussions in the United States around how some of these technologies should be regulated. there is a danger that if they're too close to that process, particularly where you've got policymakers, legislators that don't understand the technology, they're not computer scientists, there is a danger of regulatory capture. So I think we need to be very careful about that. I think, as I've already said, I think education is really one of the key cornerstones here, educating our children and us about, what this thing is, what some of the dangers are, how might we use some of these tools, and what the limitations of some of those tools are. We've all heard about hallucinations that come out of some of these large language models. They're very good at spotting patterns and then regurgitating patterns that it thinks look correct, but are essentially wrong. Too many people aren't aware of that danger. They trust what ChatGPT or any of the other models Anthropic puts out to them. Legal remedies, yep, there's those already in place, and I'm sure there'll be many more coming down the line. One of the dangers here is that they both need to be strictly enforced, something that Professor Humphreys said earlier, but also the penalties need to be severe here. I did a quick calculation a few weeks ago of the combined cash reserves of the big 5 technology companies, Apple, Alphabet, Meta, Microsoft, and Amazon. Between them, they're currently sitting on nearly $500 billion of cash reserves that they can deploy in pretty much any way they want, whether it's to pay fines, whether it's to influence the policy-making process, or to pay expensive teams of lawyers to defend their positions. So I think regulators, policymakers need to be very aware of that. And really, I guess, maybe a slightly clumsy metaphor, but whether we're talking about the poisoning of food or the poisoning of our discourse, public discourse around politics and other issues, I think there are similar solutions that seem to work fairly well in the food poisoning cases that we've seen, that perhaps the principles can be applied here. So that's really it from me. Shameless plug. Got a new book coming out where I'm going to be exploring some of these issues in a bit more detail, coming out in early 2025. I'm not going to take questions now because I know the organisers want people to move around. I'll be around throughout the day. I'll be at the dinner tonight if anybody's there. So would enjoy chatting about any of these issues if you want, if you've got any questions. I'm sure the slides will be up. My contact details are there. And as I say, all the references I've used are there just in case anybody wants to follow up on any of them. So that's it from me. Thank you very much.